The U.S. is sharing intelligence with Ukraine, and news reports say that has led to the sinking of Russia's Black Sea flagship and the deaths of several Russian generals. For more on this, geopolitical analyst Eugene Chausovsky joining us now from here in Washington. Eugene, there's been these unconfirmed reports another Russian frigate has been hit. The Pentagon, though, going on record earlier today saying they can't corroborate these reports. But even so, reporting on this ship being hit, generals being hit. Give us your sense of, is this a game changer?
Well, I think we certainly have seen the U.S. increase its support for Ukraine, both in terms of its financial and security support, and now we're seeing intelligence support increasing as well. We don't know the specific details, whether it's true or not, whether these specific generals or perhaps these warships were directly given by the U.S., but certainly we can see that the U.S. is increasing its support for Ukraine and enabling them to at least hold out against the Russian invasion.
So let's say it is true. What's more significant, taking out a flagship or providing information to kill these Russian generals? And is it not just a matter of taking out hardware or individuals, it's also an attack on morale in a sense, I would think, too.
Right. Well, I think the warships are certainly more symbolic, given that these are, very expensive and very strategic assets. But in terms of the conflict on the ground, certainly the generals, if that were to be true, really does factor into Russia's ability to wage the war, especially in eastern Ukraine, which is now their point of focus. Even though, as your previous segment discussed, there are still attacks elsewhere around the country. But I think that Russia is trying to really focus on Donbass in terms of taking and holding that territory. So the more generals that Ukraine can take out, the more difficult it is for Russia to accomplish its goals there.
Now, last month, the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said, quote, "We want to see Russia weakened to the degree it cannot do the kinds of things it has done in invading Ukraine." Russia, of course, has been claiming the U.S. is fighting a proxy war against them. If this information is out there and it's true, is that what we're seeing?
Well, I think that what we're seeing is the U.S., as I mentioned, increase its support for Ukraine in order to help Ukraine resist and potentially even push back Russian forces. Now, Russia is obviously taking issue with this, and part of its attacks in areas like Lviv and Western Ukraine are partially in order to disrupt the flow of weapons supplies and other forms of security assistance. So it is quite clear, though, that both the U.S. and Russia are ramping up attacks, not directly against each other, but yes, in essentially a proxy fashion.
Eugene, can you look at the downside of this sort of thing? Is there a danger in this information getting out there that it could actually inflame Putin to the point that he escalates attacks or expands his goals in the region?
I think the downside or the real risk is that this, the more that the U.S. and the West become involved in supporting Ukraine, and the more threatened that Russia feels from that involvement, the greatest risk is the direct conflict between Russia and NATO countries. Now, I think both sides have expressed a clear interest in trying to avoid that, but the more things escalate in that sense, the more there are chances for miscalculations. So that, I think, is going to be, as I mentioned, what both sides want to avoid, but it may be increasingly difficult to do so.
And Eugene, before we let you go, we got about 30 seconds. I'm sure you saw Sarah's report about the UN Security Council. This is not like a dramatic statement, but it is a statement. Russia signing on to it. Is that a sign that perhaps there's some diplomatic back channels at work here that may be signs that are somewhat significant? Well, what do you read into it?
I think there are diplomatic back channels, and diplomacy is actually continuing despite, the escalation of the conflict. Unfortunately, right now, the main avenue of diplomacy is on the battlefield, and only once that's exhausted is when we can probably see some real progress being made despite these UN pronouncements. So at this point, I think it's too early for that, but certainly it's an area to watch moving forward.